Hello, and welcome to Conspiracies in the War of 1812. Alright, so conspiracies. First, what is a conspiracy? Secret plot to do something bad, probably. Usually against a government. So, we've already talked about the acquisition of Louisiana and how some Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, thought it was not a good idea. In fact, it actually terrified a lot of Federalists who feared that the creation of new Western states would actually take away some of their political power or influence. So, in the winter of 1803 and 1804, a group of Federalist congressmen plotted to establish something called the Northern Confederacy, which actually consisted of like New Jersey, New York, New England, and Canada. And it was to be established with the support of Britain. Alexander Hamilton, when they asked him, was like, "You're insane. So this is crazy." So then the conspirators turned to Vice President Aaron Burr. What was to happen was, in return for the Federalist support in Aaron Burr's campaign for the governorship of New York, Burr was to swing New York into the Northern Confederacy. Unfortunately, Burr was badly beaten in the governorship race, in part because of Hamilton's opposition. So he was really ticked off. So much so that Aaron Burr challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel. And that turned out bad for Hamilton because Aaron Burr shot him and Hamilton died like 2 weeks later. So now Aaron Burr was a ruined politician. It was like he's never going to work again, basically, and a fugitive from the law. He just murdered Alexander Hamilton. Usually in a duel, it's supposed to be a matter of honor, and usually miss on purpose. Now, sometimes the bullet found its mark. Obviously, in this case, it killed Alexander Hamilton. So Aaron Burr is now in debt. He's on the edge of bankruptcy. His fortunes are at their lowest point, and so he is desperate. So he becomes involved in another conspiracy for which he would be put on trial for treason later. So in the spring of 1805, Burr traveled to the west, where he and an old friend, James Wilkinson, commander of United States forces in the Southwest and military governor of Louisiana, hatched a mysterious scheme. It's mysterious because it's really uncertain what the goal was for these people, since Burr told different stories to different people. Spain's minister believed that Burr planned to set up an independent nation in the Mississippi Valley, and others reported that he planned to seize Spanish territory in what is now Texas, California, and New Mexico. The British minister was told that for $500,000 and British naval support, Burr would separate the states and territories west of the Appalachians from the rest of the Union and create an empire with himself as its head. So in the fall of 1806, Burr and some 60 schemers traveled down the Ohio River toward New Orleans, maybe to create or start a revolt by French settlers who were upset. Wilkinson, supposedly his friend, recognized that the scheme was going to fail, so he basically told on Burr by writing a letter to President Jefferson. And of course, when Burr found out, he's like probably really upset, but he also fled. So he's on the run. He was captured in Mississippi Territory. He was then taken to Richmond, Virginia Circuit Court, where in 1807 he was tried for treason. Jefferson, convinced that Burr was a dangerous man, wanted a conviction regardless of the evidence. Think about that. Chief Justice John Marshall, who we've talked about, he was over the trial, was equally eager to discredit Jefferson. So this is like a drama between, politicians, which, if you've been paying attention, has already taken place in our country right now. Excuse me. Ultimately, Burr was acquitted. The reason for the acquittal was the Constitution's strict definition of treason as levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to the nation's enemies. In addition, each overt act of treason had to be attested by 2 witnesses. The prosecution was unable to meet this strict standard, and as a result of Burr's acquittal or being found not guilty, there have been few cases of treason tried in the United States because of this. So, was Burr guilty of conspiring to separate the West by force? Probably not. The prosecution's case was extremely weak, and it rested largely on the unreliable testimony of his backstabbing friend, James Wilkinson, who was a spy in the way of Spain while serving as a U.S. Army commander and governor of Louisiana. So, what was the purpose of Burr's scheming? It appears likely that the former vice president was planning an expedition, an unauthorized military attack on Mexico, which was then controlled by Spain. Even to the end of his life, Burr denied that he had plotted treason against the United States. And he was asked by one of his closest friends whether he had sought to separate the West from the rest of the nation. Burr responded with an emphatic quote, "No, I would as soon have thought of taking possession of the moon and informing my friends that I intended to divide it among them." So there you go. So why do I even tell you about this conspiracy? It's really because I wanted you to compare, what happened 200 years ago to today. Are there conspiracies today? Are there any other conspiracies that you've heard about? And think about this. Why does it even matter? Some conspiracies that I can think of are like Area 51 and Roswell about aliens and whether or not it's really just military exercises or is it something more. I think of JFK assassination. There was a conspiracy about whether we really landed on the moon in 1969. Yeah, people thought it was fake. There have been even conspiracies about September 11th, 2001, and whether or not, there's a ton of them. You could look them up yourself. But really, why I brought this up was a quote, or really what I mean is looking back on this, it seems that not a whole lot has changed. In fact, there's a really famous quote, still used today, that says, "The more things change, the more they stay the same." And that quote was written by a French dude named Carr in 1849. Though sure, a lot has changed in 200 years since this Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton thing. But really, how much have we changed? There's still conspiracies, there's still political drama. So why does that even matter? Think about that. Moving on. Oh, fancy, fancy. Okay. So at the same time as this conspiracy plot or whatever, Jefferson was easily reelected. Okay, so in May 1803, just 2 weeks after Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States, France declared war on Britain. And you have to understand, France and Britain never got along. They have always been fighting each other. I think the relationship is better now, but back then they were always at each other's throat. This particular war lasted 12 years. In 1805, France defeated the armies of Austria and Russia and gained control of much of the continental Europe. Napoleon then massed his troops for an invasion of England. But at the Battle of Trafalgar off the Spanish coast, the British fleet captured 14,000 French and Spanish sailors. So Britain was now master of the seas, but France remained supreme on the land. So if you can figure out who the tiger is, who the shark is, and ultimately who the eagle is. So there you go. As part of his overall strategy to bring Britain to its knees, Napoleon closed European ports to British goods and ordered the seizure of any vessel that carried British goods or stopped in a British port. Main thing is any vessel that carried British goods. Britain retaliated in 1807 by issuing something called the Orders in Council, which required all ships to land at a British port to obtain a license and pay a tariff. So United States shipping was kind of caught in the crossfire. France seized 500 of our ships and Britain nearly 1,000 of them. The most outrageous violation of America's rights was the British practice of impressment. And this is not to say that the British were like, hey, check out my Navy vessels or guns or cannons or whatever. No. So, impressment meant they seized American ships and kidnapped American sailors and forced them to work. The British Navy desperately needed sailors, and unable to get enough volunteers, the British Navy seized impressed men on streets and in taverns. When these efforts failed to muster sufficient men, the British began to stop foreign ships and remove seamen alleged to be British subjects. By 1811, nearly 10,000 American sailors had been forced into the British Navy. Some were actually deserters from British ships who made more money sailing on U.S. ships. So outrage over impressment reached a fever pitch in 1807 when the British man-of-war Leopard fired at the American naval frigate Chesapeake, killing 3 American sailors. British authorities then boarded the American ship and removed 4 sailors, only one of whom was really a British subject. So that's kind of the beginning of another conflict between the British and America. All right, so in order for us to counteract what was going on, the United States imposed something called an embargo. This is important. An embargo. What is an embargo? Look it up if you don't know. So the United States imposed an embargo on foreign trade. Jefferson regarded the embargo as an idealistic experiment, a moral alternative to war. He didn't want to go to war with Britain again. He believed that economic coercion would convince Britain and France to respect America's neutral rights. So instead of trying to fight the British, he was going to use trade or lack of trade to convince the British to stop doing what they were doing. Unfortunately, the embargo was an unpopular and costly failure. It hurt the American economy far more than the British or French and resulted in widespread smuggling. Exports fell from 108 million in 1807 to just 22 million in 1808. Farm prices fell sharply. Shippers also suffered. Harbors filled with idle ships, and nearly 30,000 sailors found themselves jobless. Jefferson believed that Americans would cooperate with the embargo out of a sense of patriotism. Instead, they turned to smuggling, particularly through Canada. To enforce the embargo, Jefferson took steps that infringed on his most cherished principles: individual liberties and opposition to a strong central government. He actually mobilized the Army and Navy to enforce the blockade and declared the Lake Champlain region of New York along the Canadian border in a state of insurrection. Pressure to abandon the embargo mounted. And in early 1809, just 3 days before Jefferson left office, Congress repealed the embargo. In effect, for 15 months, the embargo exacted no political concessions from either France or Britain, so basically it was a failure. But it had produced economic hardship, evasion of the law, and political unrest at home. Upset by the failure of his policies, the 65-year-old Jefferson looked forward to his retirement. Quote, "Never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such relief as I shall on shaking off the shackles of power." End quote. The problem of defending American rights on the high seas now fell to Jefferson's hand-picked successor, James Madison. In 1809, Congress replaced the failed embargo with the Non-Intercourse Act, which reopened trade with all nations except Britain and France. Then in 1810, Congress replaced the Non-Intercourse Act with a new measure, Macon's Bill No. 2. This policy reopened trade with France and Britain. It stated, however, that if either Britain or France agreed to respect America's neutral rights, the United States would immediately stop trade with the other nation. Napoleon's like, yes, that's what we're going to do. Napoleon seized on this new policy in an effort to entangle the United States in his war with Britain. So he announced a repeal of all French restrictions on American trade. Even though France continued to seize American ships and cargoes, President Madison snapped at the bait. In early 1811, he cut off trade with Britain and recalled the American minister. So for 19 months, the British went without any American trade. And that resulted in food shortages, mounting unemployment, and increasing inventories of unsold manufactured goods finally convinced Britain to end their restrictions on American trade. But the decision came too late, unfortunately. On June 1st, 1812, President Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war. A divided House and Senate concurred. The House voted to declare war on Britain by a vote of 79 to 49, and the Senate by a vote of 19 to 13. So this is a image of the proclamation of war, and you can look at that a little closer. But it says, signed by James Madison and eventually the Secretary of State, James Monroe. Hopefully this is a name that you recognize. James Monroe, Secretary of State. So that's kind of cool. Alright, so we have declared war against Britain. Again, remember this is like 25, 35, 36 years after our Declaration of Independence. Excuse me. So the War of 1812 is also known as the Second War of Independence. So the main reason was the British interference with the United States trade. The most loudly voiced grievance was British interference with American rights on the high seas. Free trade and sailors' rights was a popular battle cry. But if British harassment of American shipping was the primary motivation for war, then why did the pro-war majority in Congress come largely from the South, the West, and the frontier, and not from the Northeastern ship owners and sailors? Northeastern Federalists regarded war with Britain as a really big mistake. The United States, they feared, could not hope to successfully challenge British supremacy on the seas, and the government could not finance a war without bankrupting the country. That's really actually logical. One, we don't have a navy that can fight the largest and most successful navy in the whole entire world. And two, we don't have enough money to do this. But, excuse me, Southerners and Westerners were eager to avenge British insults against American honor. Many Westerners and Southerners had their eye on expansion, viewing war as an opportunity to add Canada and Spanish-held Florida to the United States. So war with Britain also offered another incentive: the possibility of clearing western lands of Indians by removing the Indians' strongest ally, the British. In late 1811, General William Henry Harrison provoked a fight with an Indian alliance at Tippecanoe Creek in Indiana. Since British guns were found on the battlefield, many Americans concluded that Britain was responsible for the incident. Weary of Jefferson and Madison's policy of economic coercion, voters swept 63 out of 142 representatives out of Congress in 1810 and replaced them with young Republicans that Federalists dubbed war hawks. Having grown up on tales of heroism during the American Revolution, second-generation Republicans were eager to prove their manhood in a second war of independence. So what I would like you to do now is watch this crash course, and it'll give you some more information about the War of 1812, and hopefully it'll be a lot more entertaining than me. All right. So, to sum up and hopefully reinforce what John Green said, the United States was terribly unprepared for war. Our army consisted of fewer than 7,000 soldiers, a few trained officers, and a navy with just 6 warships. 6! In contrast, Britain had nearly 400 warships. 400. So our strategy was to invade Canada. What? Well, Canada was held by the British, so if we kept on attacking Canada, maybe they'd stop. So we were supposed to invade Canada and harass British shipping. The attack on Canada, however, was a failure, epic fail. At Detroit, 2,000 American troops surrendered to a much smaller British and Indian force. An attack across the Niagara River near Buffalo resulted in 900 American prisoners of war. Along Lake Champlain, a third army retreated into American territory after failing to cut undefended British supply lines. So, not good. In 1813, America suffered new failures, including the defeat and capture of the American army in the swamps west of Lake Erie. Only a series of unexpected victories at the end of the year raised American spirits. On September 10, 1813, America won a major naval victory at the Battle of Lake Erie near Put-in Bay at the western end of Lake Erie. There, Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry, remember that guy, okay? Oliver Hazard Perry, who had built a fleet at Presque Isle, which is basically Erie, Pennsylvania. He successfully engaged 6 British ships. Though Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, was disabled in the fighting, he went on to capture the British fleet. He reported his victory with the stirring words, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The Battle of Lake Erie was America's first major victory of the war, and it forced the British to abandon Detroit and retreat toward Niagara. On October 5, 1813, Major General William Henry Harrison overtook the retreating British army and their Indian allies at the Thames River. He won a decisive victory in which the Indian leader Tecumseh was killed, thereby ending the fighting strength of the northwestern Indians. So I just wanted to point out a couple of battles that we've been talking about. There's the Battle of the Thames here. There's Detroit. And this area is blown up down here. Here's Put in Bay that they talked about. And the Battle of Lake Erie was all up in here. And here are some very famous paintings to commemorate Oliver Hazard Perry's famous quote and major victory. Here's a little bit more of the quote. "We have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." All right, almost done. In the spring of 1814, Britain defeated Napoleon in Europe, freeing 18,000 veteran British troops to participate in an invasion of the United States. The British planned to invade the United States at 3 points: upstate New York, the Chesapeake Bay, and New Orleans. The London Times expressed the confident English mood. "Oh, may no false liberality, no mistaken lenity, no weak and cowardly policy interpose to save the United States from the blow. Strike! Chastise the savages, for such they are. Our demands may be couched in a single word: submission." At Niagara, however, American forces, outnumbered more than 3 to 1, halted Britain's invasion from the north. Britain then landed 4,000 soldiers on the Chesapeake Bay coast and marched on Washington, D.C., where untrained soldiers lacking uniforms and standard equipment were protecting the capital. And the result was chaos. President Madison narrowly escaped capture by British forces. On August 24, 1814, the British humiliated the nation by capturing and burning Washington, D.C. President Madison and his wife Dolly were forced to flee the capital, carrying with them many of the nation's treasures, including the Declaration of Independence and Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington. The British arrived so soon after the president fled that the officers dined on a White House meal that had been prepared for the Madisons and 40 invited guests. It's like they weren't even thinking that they were coming. I don't know. That's crazy. Britain's next objective was Baltimore. To reach the city, British warships had to pass the guns of Fort McHenry, manned by 1,000 American soldiers. Waving atop the fort was the largest garrison flag ever designed, 30 feet by 42 feet. On September 13th, 1814, British warships began a 25-hour bombardment of Fort McHenry. British vessels anchored 2 miles offshore, close enough so that their guns could hit the fort, but too far for American shells to reach them. All through the night, British cannons bombarded Fort McHenry, firing between 1,500 and 1,800 cannonballs at the fort. In the light of the rockets' red glare and bombs bursting in air, Francis Scott Key, a young lawyer detained on a British ship, saw the American flag waving over the fort. At dawn on September 14th, he saw the flag still waving, and the Americans had repulsed the British attack with only 4 soldiers killed and 24 wounded. Key was so moved by the American victory that he wrote a poem entitled "The Star-Spangled Banner" on the back of an old envelope, and the song was destined to become the young nation's national anthem. Pretty cool. However, the country still faced grave threats in the south. On January 8, 1815, the British fleet and a battle-tested 10,000-man army finally attacked New Orleans. To defend the city, Jackson, that would be Andrew Jackson, assembled a ragtag army including French pirates, Choctaw Indians, Western militia, and freed slaves. Although British forces outnumbered Americans by more than 2 to 1, American artillery and sharpshooters stopped the invasion. American losses totaled only 8 dead and 13 wounded, while British casualties were over 2,000. The ironic thing here is that American and British negotiators in Ghent, Belgium, had signed the peace treaty ending the War of 1812 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans. Britain, convinced that the American war was so difficult and costly that nothing would be gained from further fighting, finally agreed to return to the conditions that existed before the war. Left unmentioned in the peace treaty were the issues over which Americans had fought the war: impressment and the British interference with American trade. So here are some paintings. Again, we didn't have movies or photographs yet, so this is how they commemorated these major events. The British burning the Capitol. So here's the White House back here. Here's General Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. And down here is the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium, finally ending the war. So really, why in the world is this war even significant, especially since it really didn't solve any of the problems that it first set out to deal with? First, it really effectively destroyed the Indians' ability to resist American expansion east of the Mississippi River. General Andrew Jackson crushed the Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, while General William Henry Harrison defeated Indians in the Old Northwest at the Battle of the Thames. Abandoned by their British allies, the Indians reluctantly ceded most of their lands north of the Ohio River and in the southern and western Alabama to the United States government. The other thing was that the war allowed the United States to rewrite its boundaries with Spain and solidify control over the lower Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. Even though the United States really didn't defeat Great Britain, it was more like a tie. But America had really fought the world's strongest power. So it was like kind of in your face kind of thing. It's more like of a psychological victory rather than a political or an economic one. And Spain recognized that. And in 1819, Spanish leaders abandoned Florida and agreed to American boundary running clear of the Pacific Ocean. They're like, you can have Florida. The other thing was that the Federalist Party never recovered from its opposition to the war, meaning the Federalist political party pretty much disappeared. They were seen, as traitors for opposing the war, and they even talked about seceding, and that wasn't very popular at the time. So the proposals of these particular ideas from the Federalists became public knowledge, and this created a really unpopular view of the Federalists, and so they kind of disappeared. Now, obviously, it was a major boost in U.S. nationalism, and we got out of it our Star-Spangled Banner. So there you go. Conspiracies and the War of 1812. I hope it was as enlightening as it was to me. Questions? Come and ask me. Thank you for listening.